If you have any kind of history in literature, you may have heard the short story by a guy named Frank Stockton that is called The Lady or the Tiger. I'll give you a kind of recap of the story. It is actually written in a very olden time. There lived a semi-barbaric king whose ideas of determining justice were indeed quite barbaric. This king had a daughter, beautiful and fair, the envy of every woman in the nation. She could have any man in the kingdom, but her heart was set on a lowly stable boy. He had no position and no wealth, but he was handsome and made her heart leap. It was not long before the two fell in love and began to meet in secret. Unfortunately for them, their secret love was discovered by the king, and the king, furious, ordered the boy to be captured and jailed. The king was outraged that his daughter had stooped so low, and he began to devise the cruelest punishment that he could fathom. And then he thought of it. The boy would be taken into the public arena and be given a choice of chance. Two identical doors would stand before him. Behind one, the loveliest maiden that he could find in all the kingdom. Behind the other, the most ferocious tiger that could be found. If he chose the door with the maiden, he would be forgiven for his transgressions and immediately married to the fair maiden. If he chose the door with the tiger, he would pay the price for his misdeeds and be torn to shreds and devoured. The tiger cages of the kingdom were searched for the most savage and relentless beast, and the country was searched for the fairest maiden that could be found. The king found a particularly fitting woman, one that almost matched the princess in her beauty, and one who everyone knew was close to the stable boy, perhaps a little too close. It was known that the princess was jealous of this relationship and felt threatened by this particular fair maiden. So the stage was set, the appointed day arrived, all was ready. The king and the princess were seated as they waited. The king leaned over and told the princess who the fair maiden was. The princess glared at him. How cruel. Anyone but her. Then, to her amazement, the king told her which door the beautiful maiden was behind. Then he sat back and smiled. The signal was given and the stable boy emerged, tall, handsome, fair. No wonder the princess loved him. What a terrible thing for him to be there. He was pale and trembling with fear. His eyes were fixed upon the princess, hoping she knew, hoping she could give him some guidance. His glance shouted at her, "Which door?" And there was not an instant to be lost. Her right hand lay on the cushioned rail before her. She raised her hand and made a slight, quick movement toward the right. No one but her lover saw it. Every eye but his eyes were fixed on the man in the arena. He turned, and with a firm and rapid step, he walked across the empty space. Every heart stopped beating. Every breath was held. Every eye was fixed invocably upon that man. Without the slightest hesitation, he went to the door on the right and opened it, and the end. No, seriously, that's how the story ends. Are you okay with that ending? That's how it ends. How many of you want me to tell you the real ending? The real ending, this is not how it was written, but the real ending is the princess goes all Liam Neeson, kills the tiger, and rescues her love. And they live happily ever after. So there you go. Now you have an ending that you can live with. We're all good. All the loose ends are tied up. No, the story is written with you answering the question. What was behind the door, the tiger or the lady? It was written to create the tension that you felt and what was the outcome. They don't tie up all the loose ends. Like some of us like that freedom to be able to determine the ending of the story, the opportunity to use our imagination and craft our own ending. Others hate the ending. They feel like it's incomplete, unfinished, unanswered. And that tension just sits there at the end of the story waiting to be resolved. So what does any of this have to do with Easter, right? The Gospel of Mark is one of four Gospels written by four different writers who each had a unique way of telling their story. The goal of each Gospel writer is to put us into the story. The way the other three Gospels unfold is this kind of happy ending to a horrible event, except for Mark. Mark kind of forgets the happily ever after part of the story. Matthew and Luke and John tell stories of Jesus appearing to women and struggling disciples. He cements their faith. There's rejoicing. There's hope. There's the announcement to go and tell this good news to the world, but not Mark. Mark is the least popular account. Mark has this kind of hard stop at the end, no resolution. He leaves us guessing. As a matter of fact, the English Bible that you're holding in your hands probably has some bracket there that says the rest of Mark we're not really sure exists. It's not found in the earliest manuscripts. And the reason we're not sure that it exists is because the scribes who came along long after Mark wrote his gospel thought this doesn't end well. We need to add something to it, to this ending. So they kind of took some of the popular stories around Jesus in his day. But from all evidence, Mark's gospel just stops at verse 8. So let's revisit this story, and we'll talk about this very abrupt ending of what's going on. Verse 1, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. So Mark introduces these three women to us. They were there last week watching where Jesus was buried. These three women are Mary Magdalene, who was rescued from a spectacularly wretched life by Jesus. Mary, who the text says is the mother of James. Most believe this is also the mother of Jesus. The James here would have been the brother of Jesus. And then Salome, or if you're in the South, you can call her Salami if you choose. Salome, who most scholars believe is the mother of James and John. All three gather to show respect to Jesus, to show gratitude. They are loyal followers. They are servants of Jesus, and they go to perform, this religious ritual over a dead body. Verse 3. And they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled back. It was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. So they come to the tomb, grieving and questioning, who will move the stone? They find the stone has been rolled back, and just inside the tomb, there's this young man who is donning this sparkling white clothes. And if you know anything about the scriptures, you know that the preferred garment, the preferred style among the supernatural seems to be sparkling white. Okay, so I wore my sparkling white shoes today to honor the sparkling white wardrobe of the angels. Many of you wearing your sparkling white today on Easter Sunday. Well, this young man has an announcement to make. Verse 6, he said to them, do not be alarmed. I repeat that, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell his disciples and Peter. Tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him just as you told him. So he makes this announcement. Jesus is not here. He is risen. See, and you can almost visualize him pointing, right? See, look, he's not in here. The place where he was laid is empty. Now go tell the disciples. And by the way, please tell Peter. This is important. We'll come back to it in a moment. Jesus is going ahead of you. This word in the original language means to lead the troops. Jesus is going ahead of you, and you will see him just like he said. Jesus has given them a lot of heads up. I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to die. I'm going to be beaten. And then after 3 days, I'm going to come back to life. Over and over and over again, he's told his followers that. I'm going to come back to life. But here they are at the tomb looking for the dead Jesus, which seems to make sense in verse 8. And they went out, fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Hard stop by Mark. They ran out of the tomb, trembling, astonished, and scared into silence. And then Mark just ends his story. An empty tomb, fear, and a failure to obey. Not the happily ever after that we often expect, right? This is the what was behind the door on the right moment. No worship, no singing, no sharing, no celebrating. Now we know from other writers, the other gospel writers, these ladies did believe, they did rejoice, they did proclaim the good news. They were the first announcers of the resurrection, but for now, they do not. And Mark makes sure that we know it. He leaves us in suspense. No real ending here. Now, is this how we want to leave the Easter story? Is this why you came to church on Easter Sunday, expecting this message? Like, what is Mark doing? What Mark is doing is he brings us into the gospel message, into the story. You see, the resurrection does not mean that everything broken in this current life is now made right and everyone lives happily ever after. Mark draws us into his narrative because, like his readers, the audience to whom Mark was writing in the first century, we are people that are familiar with the resurrection, but we are removed from it. We were not there. We do not experience the physical presence of Jesus, and yet we are asked to embrace the resurrection as the cornerstone of our faith. And so Mark's account reminds us that even as resurrection people, we live with a level of uncertainty. We want the story to include instant victory and celebration and triumph, but that's not Mark's situation. He is writing to people facing uncertainty and suffering and possible death, and Jesus is not physically present. He has been taken away. And so the people who headline Mark's story, they lack faith, they are filled with fear, and they are considered failures. After all, Mark himself was a failure. Peter, who most believe are behind Mark's story, is a failure. The angel says, go tell the disciples, and specifically tell who? Tell the failure. Tell Peter. Tell the guy that denied me the night before I was crucified. Go tell the disciples and Peter. You see, Mark's narrative reminds us that the good news of the gospel is for those who are weak, and those who are inadequate, and those who are uncertain, and those who are fearful. The good news is for the disappointments and the failures and the misfits and the doubters. The good news that we've seen throughout Mark's gospel is that Jesus came for outsiders. And the resurrection puts the final nail in the coffin of religious effort, and it reminds us it's not about what I do for God, but about what God has done for me. You see, Easter differentiates between a consumer-driven religion that says my standing with God is based on what I do or do not do. It differentiates between a consumer religion and the gospel of grace that says it is about what has been done on your behalf. Not the do's and the don'ts, but the done. You see, the gospel is not about running a few religious errands for God. It's not about tipping your hat in God's direction or living what you consider an above-average moral life or whatever religious ritual that you perform to make yourself feel better spiritually. What Easter announces is neither you nor I are in charge. You're not coming to God on your terms. He comes to us on His terms. To put it in Mark's terms, Jesus does not need you to take care of His dead body, to anoint His body with spices. Jesus does not need us to perform religious ritual and to care for His dead body. God raised Jesus from the dead, and the risen Jesus generates life in dead souls. So put the spices away. Put the religious rituals away. It is God who awakens our hearts to the gospel, who made Jesus alive. And once these ladies grasp that Jesus is alive, their well-intended religious rituals do not define their identity any longer. You see, He is not dead, He is alive, and they are afraid. They are afraid because this is something new. They're not ready for this. This is not the kingdom of God that they anticipated or expected or planned for, and in this moment, it rattles them. It shakes them. And yet they are invited, aren't they? They're invited to live, to believe in Jesus as the one who is alive, to truly live. And what they will soon discover is that Christ is not only alive among them, but He is alive in them and working through them as the Spirit of God takes up residence in them. You see, these ladies were on the verge of living, of life, and yet they were hesitant and unsure. And the same is true today in every generation since. You see, just like in Mark's story, there's three specific groups that are here today. There are those who are struggling with their faith. This is the who's going to roll the stone away crowd. We're on the way to the tomb, like, who's going to roll away the stone, struggling with faith. And again, in this context, this is a fair question, right? These are three ladies. Like, who's going to roll away this stone? It is okay to question. It is okay to doubt. You see, faith is not always the opposite of doubt. Faith is often the opposite of certainty. If I am certain about something, I don't need faith to believe in it. That's why the Hebrews writer says faith is evidence of things hoped for, that it's not certain. You see, life generates questions, doesn't it? Life generates question. Think about these ladies. They just watched Jesus bleed to death on the cross. They just watched him go through suffering. They just watched him cry out to his Father. They watched Jesus die, literally die on a cross. And so life is filled with suffering and pain and brokenness and hurt and death. And as a result, doubt happens, questions happens. What is causing questions in your life? What is causing doubt in your life? You see, the promise of God is not the removal of uncertainty. It's the promise is the presence of God. That faith happens in the mysteries of life. That faith happens in the uncertainties of life. And so the resurrection question for those who are grappling with faith is this question: is it real? Is it real? Not was it real? Not was the resurrection an actual event? The question is the resurrection real? You see, dropping by the tomb on occasion, once a year, dropping by the tomb does not generate nor sustain faith in your life. Resurrection faith and power happens in the everyday as Jesus meets us in the uncertainties, as he meets us in the mysteries of life. Faith is taking the step beyond being occupied with myself, my life, to paying attention to a God who is occupied with us, to a God who is pursuing us, who is drawing us into faith and out of ambiguity. And the question for us is, will we take a step in his direction? Will I turn from being occupied with myself, my dreams, my way? We call this repentance. Will I turn and believe? Put my faith, not in the certainty, but put my faith in God who raised Jesus from the dead and has promised his presence amid the uncertainty. So are you struggling with faith today? Turn and believe. How about those who are struggling with fear? When they hear the news that Jesus has been raised back to life, it generates not this rush of hope in their life, it generates this fear, because this is where humanity and God's power collide in this moment. You see, the resurrection changed everything. It's not just another chapter in the story, it turns the face of history in this moment. You see, up until this moment, these women have witnessed his miracles. They have listened to his teachings. They followed Jesus. They heard him speak of these things. They experienced his suffering and death. And now they have come to care for his body. Their lives are filled with religious tasks, with rituals, with moral efforts, very similar to the efforts that we tend to take and make. I'm going to take my kids to Sunday school. I'm going to attempt to live a God-attentive life. I'm going to work hard. I'm going to attend church regularly. I'm going to strive to be a good neighbor, a good friend, good family member. But then the gospel comes along and it announces you're not in charge. God is. You are not in control. God is. You see, you're not partnering with Jesus to somehow try and tip the scales in your moral favor. You see, religious effort, moral behavior adjustments and modification in life is not what rescues you. As a matter of fact, Paul says it's what condemns us, because our moral efforts somehow cause us to think that we have measured up to God's standard somehow. Let me tell you good news today. You can never do enough or try hard enough or be good enough, because you are a sinner. And this is the good news. The gospel is good news for rebels, for sinners, for people who have turned from God through their own unrighteousness or through their efforts at self-righteousness. And when we are confronted with this story of a God who moved in among us, who did what we were unable to do, and who died as one of us, there's a natural reaction of fear. A fear of knowing God and, maybe more importantly, being known by God. And so what we do is we tend to keep God at arm's length because we feel like I'm not good enough. I don't measure up. I do not know enough. What about my past? What about my present? What about the dark corners of my heart no one knows about? I don't measure up. We are afraid that if God knows us, that He will not like us because we know what's going on. And so our reaction to that is we tend to busy ourselves with religious tasks. We try to platform ourselves. Well, God, look at all these good things that I do. Or we compare ourselves to others. Like, I know I'm not living a perfect life, but at least I'm not like that neighbor, or at least I'm not as bad as that coworker. I don't do these things. And so we try to platform, or we try to compare, or we try to pretend things about us are true or not true, that we are less sinful than we really are, or that we are more righteous than we really are, and that dark part of my heart is not the real me. There is an ingrained fear of being known. The question, does God really love me? And the resurrection question for those grappling with this fear is this question: is what Jesus did on the cross enough for you? Is it enough? Let me phrase it this way: are there limits on a love without limits? Are there limits on a love without limits? You see, what if God is a God who fully knows us and knows us more than we even know ourselves? What if God is a God who fully knows us and fully loves us? What if He is a God who fully knows us and loves without limits? What if the gospel is true? What if God stepped into our space because He knows us that deeply and desires relationship with us despite our sin and insecurities and fears? What if true love is found when we allow ourselves to be fully known by God? And the resurrection says what Jesus did is enough for you. It's enough. Turn to Him and believe. There's a third struggle here. Those struggling with failure. This is the "and Peter" group. Go tell the disciples and Peter. You see, Peter, most scholars believe, is the disciple behind Mark's story. And you can almost see Peter looking over Mark as he writes his story, and Peter maybe saying to Mark as he pens his narrative in this moment, make sure that you include those two words. Make sure you include the two words "and Peter." Make sure that they know that these are words of hope. Make sure that they know that Jesus is saying, I know what Peter did. I know how he betrayed. I know how he failed me. Now go tell him that I want to see him. You ever feel like a failure? You ever feel like you let someone down, that you don't measure up? Ever feel like you don't measure up to God's standards? Ever feel like you don't even measure up to your own standards? Ever feel like you don't measure up to everyone else's standards around you? Guess what? You are a failure. So am I. We have all fallen short. It's why we need Jesus, because God loves failures, because Jesus died for failures, because grace redeems failures. The gospel is not about your ability to measure up. The gospel reminds us that Jesus died for those whose sin separates us from a holy God. He took our place. The very last words that Jesus utters from the cross in the Gospel of Mark, we saw him last week, is Jesus crying out to the Father, my God, why have you forsaken me? And in that moment, he is being forsaken for our failures. So here's the resurrection question for those grappling with failure. Is his love greater than your biggest and darkest failure? Is his love greater than your biggest and darkest failure? I love how Paul phrases this in Romans 5:8. God demonstrates his love for us, and that while we were, what's that next word? Still sinners, Christ died for us. Still sinners, It's not clean yourself up, measure up, get your life together, start doing all these 10 things. It's not the do's and don'ts list that we try to put around our spiritual barometer, that Jesus meets us right where we are. It's the red doors of City Church. It's when you're in the space that Jesus meets you right where you are. And Mark's account reminds us that the conclusion of the story is not dependent on your human performance or your lack of failures, but on a God who has done what God has done on our behalf. The resurrection reminds us God acted on our behalf. Turn to Him and believe. Through this entire journey, through Mark's gospel, for those of us who have been here, the very opening phrase that Mark uses about his story, his narrative, what he was writing, is he tells us from the beginning that this is the beginning of the gospel, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. That Mark says this is the beginning of the gospel. You see, the resurrection is not the end. The resurrection is the beginning. We cannot allow the resurrection to become this kind of cherished memory in the photo album that's pulled out once a year and admired. Right? It's like going to your parents at Christmas and you're pulling the picture albums off and checking out all the old photos. That's not what Easter is. It's not just we pull it off the shelf once a year and admire it. Mark pulls us into the story. We are the next chapter. We are pulled into this story with other people who are filled with fear, marked by failure, and wrestling with faith. And we are reminded the gospel is for you. The gospel is enough for you. Everyone is included. No one is excluded. The unimportant, the insignificant, male, female, stranger, newcomer, child, sick, disabled, poor, criminal, failure, young, old. You are invited into God's story of redemption, the story of life. And so God is calling today. And the question is, will we step into the story? Afraid? Me too. Feel like a failure? Me too. Struggle with faith? Me too. It's why the gospel is such good news, because it is for people just like you and just like me. So come on home. He is calling. Turn to Him and believe, because the resurrection is just the beginning of your story. And God is inviting you into His redemptive story. Will you trust Him?